Let's talk about joint enterprise structures, or what is also termed stakeholder governance or multi-stakeholder governance. This concept sounds very dry and technical, and it's ultimately a very simple concept, but for me it was revelatory in terms of how I think about alternative economic structures. So, one example of a joint enterprise, I guess I should just say what a joint enterprise basically is. Let's say the government wants to establish some sort of public enterprise. It's creating some sort of public project or another. Okay? It can either govern that enterprise directly and have it be managed by the state directly, with the state limiting its budget to account for other projects that the state also has to have in its budget built in. Or it could create a separate governing body and give that body complete autonomy to do what it wants with the state money. The problem with the latter option is that if the state creates some sort of publicly funded endeavor, but gives that local institution as much autonomy to do whatever it wants with the state's money, then the state might end up wasting its money on an institution that demands as much money as it can possibly get. So it's necessary to have a governing body that is made up of both the local institutional knowledge of this small, more community-based institution and the more centralized knowledge of the overarching government itself. So the way you would do this is literally creating a board of executives that contains 50% membership from people who are representative of that government and 50% membership from people who are representative of that particular board. So let's say that it's a regional energy cooperative of some kind that is providing energy to this region, this city region, which is a real example of this in practice. That organization has a body that is made up of people from that organization who know what they're doing, who know what they're talking about, who have the relevant expertise and the lived experience of the people on the ground floor. And those people get to determine what actually gets done with that money and with those resources. But in order to come to a decision, they must be on a 50-50 board with members of the government. So you have to build a majority coalition that serves the needs of the collective governing body and the local institution equally. Only once there's a majority coalition where everybody can be happy with the proposal does it move forward. Now I'm going to give you 3 separate proposals that would use this joint enterprise structure. One is to democratize our bureaucracy. The way that you would do this is by integrating some amount of sortition, which is a process in which people are selected at random from the general population, sort of like jury duty, and put into a room where they're making decisions about some or another specific government agency. So we don't have the capacity within Congress, for example, to always hold the bureaucracy completely accountable. This is a problem conservatives often have, that they criticize what's called the administrative state, or sometimes the deep state, have their own sort of delegated authority that we give to them to make decisions. And that can be a little bit problematic because they're unelected officials making decisions on the taxpayers' behalf. Now, on the other hand, to simply give them free rein for these sort of technocratic experts to make these decisions however they want would also be a problem. And the legislature can't really rein them in completely because our lawmakers just do not have the time and energy to focus on every single intricate detail of every process of regulation that our government handles. So they have to delegate at least somewhat. So what if the bodies and organizations that they delegated to had an element of democratic accountability actually built into them, where the people themselves are integrated into the process of government, not just at the macro level of overall legislation, but at the individual bureaucratic agency level. Another proposal is for democratically governed public banks. So having a public bank that is created by the government is an old idea, but recently people like Thomas Hannah of the Democracy Collaborative have proposed a specific model in which people are selected at random and integrated on an annual basis to make important decisions about the overall direction of investment of the bank. They're brought in with experts and people who work at the bank on the day-to-day to actually explain what the bank does and how these sorts of economic factors operate, and then they collectively make a decision about what sorts of things their community wants to see invested in the near future. This democratic governing body of the bank involves an element of the role of experts, an element of local democratic accountability over the bank by the people who bank with them directly, but then it also involves an element of the government as well. So there's a joint model where there is a board that contains ordinary people as well as experts from the bank itself, and then members of the government who need to manage the overall budget because they're putting money into the public banks, which can be used to invest in things that a normal private bank maybe wouldn't be able to invest in because it's not profitable. But at the same time, the government has to worry about funding other public projects and can't invest all of its money into the public banks. Finally, there are what are called public commons partnerships. In a public commons partnership, the institution in question is not so much a straightforward market institution, but is instead what is called a commons. A commons is a concept I'm going to be talking about more on this channel, but one form of commons that I think is really comprehensible and understandable is a trust. So when you go to set aside money in, say, a trust for your children to go to college, that money is no longer yours, but it's also not entirely your children's. It's managed by a board of trustees who ensure that the word of the law that you agreed to is carried out. And so it can be accessed by your children exclusively, but only for the purposes that it was established for. Similarly, trusts are often used to protect conservation sites because protected resources that are held in a legal trust are not the property of the government, but they're also not the property of private entities who would seek to purchase that land and develop on it. Putting a land that needs to be protected in a trust is a way of protecting it from industry and development, both at the level of the state and at the level of the market. Additionally, there are trusts for things like housing. If you have a community land trust for housing, then the thing that you're normally trying to protect is the ability for that housing to be affordable in the long run. A lot of time, housing is used as a speculative asset, where people will buy the housing and then try to flip it and make more money in the long run. So it treats housing as primarily something for profit and only secondarily something that people live in. In a community land trust, there are strict rules about how much you can sell your house for that are collectively agreed upon and stapled to inflation by the trustees. So no individual owner of a home on a community land trust completely owns the home in a traditional sense, because there are strict rules about the ways that they can then sell that home. It allows them to get a home affordably, but it doesn't allow them to sell that home for a significant profit. In a public commons partnership, which can be anything from one of these community land trusts for housing like I described, to a community garden, the community has its own membership and its own decision-making body, and it would need to form a organization, a board of executives of sorts, where It is made up 50% of people from that community that governs this collective resource, and 50% from the government that is investing in those commons and trying to support and uplift this alternative commons structure. By doing this, we can expand the commons without taking the entire economy under state control, and without allowing them to be desecrated by the market. One thing I've noticed about this sort of approach of integrating the local knowledge of individual businesses or commons organizations with the broader goals of collective governance and democratic socialism or something along those lines, is that you can also see the beginnings of these ideas forming in conservative economic organizations like the American Compass, which argues for a joint multi-stakeholder form of safety regulation for individual businesses. They basically argue that by having unions be very involved directly in the process of determining safety standards for businesses, you can create safety standards that aren't made from on high, which is something conservatives are obviously very concerned about. I'll give you a great example. One of the workplaces I worked at last was unable to install a ramp for people to walk down and to roll heavy automobile parts down this ramp because it needed to fit ADA compliance, which needed us to have the ramp be a certain size. They were designating that in order to be as helpful for disabled people as possible, the ramp needed to meet certain specifications, and because we couldn't meet those specifications, we couldn't build the ramp, which meant that we had to have stairs, which was obviously worse for disabled people and for everyone involved. So this well-intentioned disability protection regulation had an unintended ill effect. Libertarians and conservatives talk about these effects all the time, but a lot of times they turn to the market for solutions, and I don't believe that that's a very good solution either. So these joint enterprises would involve a degree of collaboration between unions, management, and the government in order to ensure things like safety standards are actually met with the lived knowledge of people like the union who work there and know what is actually necessary to be safe and what sorts of safety demands the government might create that are inefficient or thoughtless or don't really apply to their particular workplace or their particular circumstances. If you want to learn more about any of the subjects I am talking about, I have links in the description below. I'm going to try and link as many video sources as well as detailed written proposals as possible. This has been very fleshed out by groups like the Democracy Collaborative and the American Compass. This is not an abstract theoretical idea. There are very detailed think tank style policy proposals of how to implement this wherever you live.